Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting organized by Civita. Also a warm welcome to all watching this event online. My name is Mathilde Fasting and I will be today's moderator. This is a recorded meeting with a live audience here in this room, so if there are any sounds, it's because we have people watching this online when we are speaking. Our guests today are Richard Bennett, he is the UN Special Reporter on Human Rights in Afghanistan, and Tom Siden, Chairman of Human Rights Research League, and who published also the report Those We Left Behind, Revenge Killings and Other Serious Human Rights Violations in Afghanistan in the Aftermath of the Taliban's Seizure of Power in November 2023. Before we start, I'll go through a few practical details. There will be an introduction by Richard Bennett and comments from Tom Siden, and then a moderated Q&A. We have a hard stop after about 50 minutes. So, left to the Taliban, what future for an Afghanistan caught in the past? And I'll leave it to you, Richard Bennett, to present your work and telling me what are you doing now and what have you been doing in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you very much, Mathilde, for your kind introduction, and thanks also to Civita for providing this opportunity. And I'd also like to say that it's a pleasure to share this platform with Tom. I was appointed 2 years ago by the Human Rights Council shortly after the Taliban took over in Afghanistan. This was because it was considered by member states of the UN that there needed to be another human rights mechanism monitoring the situation in Afghanistan. My role is to assess and report on the human rights situation and to make recommendations for improvements on it. I am able to go to Afghanistan. I have been 3 times in this role. I hope that I'll be able to go again in the future. I report actually to just about every Human Rights Council meeting on Afghanistan, and I also report annually to the General Assembly. So a lot of my time is made in reporting. But I joined reporting with advocacy because I think it's very important to keep Afghanistan in the news. Let's face it, it is no longer on the front pages unless there's an earthquake or a flood. But for the human rights situation, and especially the desperate situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, it is very seldom on the front pages. My second role is to document human rights violations and preserve them. So I systematically put together documentation, and just as Human Rights Research League has made this report published a few months ago, I am also taking testimony from Afghans, from witnesses, and recording it, reporting on it, but also particularly preserving it for the future, for possible accountability processes in the future. I'm also tasked with promoting the international human rights treaties, and I note that Afghanistan has actually signed up to most of the major treaties, and they still apply. It doesn't matter who is in the government, even if it's a de facto regime. The human rights treaties apply to the state, and the Taliban has not denied that. I also am tasked with engaging and working with civil society, and that actually is a really important part of the role, and it's a pleasure to come to Norway to engage with civil society, be it Civita or particularly Afghans who have settled in Norway, and it was my pleasure to have a very good meeting with them yesterday. Some of them in the audience today as well. Approach to the work, that I integrate gender into the work completely, and also a child rights centered approach. My last report was at the February-March session of the Human Rights Council, the most recent one, and I reported generally on the human rights situation then. I reported that the situation is still deteriorating, and evidenced by increasing violations, particularly of women and girls' rights. And at that point, I talked about the harsh enforcement of the Taliban's dress code, which was more in the news earlier this year. I noted that there'd been no progress on girls' education, and the audience may be aware that Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls beyond 6th grade are barred from education, and women barred from university as well. There are also severe restrictions on women's right to work. It's also the only country where women staff of the UN system have been told to stay home, which I think is shocking. It's actually a violation of the UN Charter, and the UN ought to stand up against that, in my opinion. And of course, international NGOs can only also continue to employ women in certain sectors. There are some exemptions in the health sector and the medical sector, in the education sector. The rights of minorities, and I know it's a bit sensitive talking about minorities these days, but marginalized groups, for reason of ethnicity or religion or other reasons like disability and their LGBTI status, are also under great pressure in Afghanistan. Civic space has shrunk, continues to shrink. Pressure on not only on journalists but also on writers and publishers. And there's been a notable increase in recent months of very harsh Sharia punishments known as qisas and hudud. You probably know these more in terms of public flogging, public execution. There have not been so many executions, but there are certainly almost weekly floggings, which are mandated by the state in Afghanistan. I could go on. The economics, the humanitarian situation is very serious. And Afghans have a right to basic economic, social, and cultural rights, which are largely being denied. My work that I'm doing right now was specifically requested by the Human Rights Council. I was asked to write a thematic report, and I'm just finishing it up, on the phenomenon of an institutionalized system of discrimination, segregation, disrespect for human dignity, and exclusion of women and girls, building on a report that I did jointly with the UN Working Group on discrimination against women and girls last year. So I have consulted as broadly as I can in Afghanistan with Afghan women and men, and also face-to-face here in Europe, as well as online in other parts of the world, including the US and Canada. Have drafted this report, which I will be presenting to the Human Rights Council next month, probably on June the 18th. It's a deeper analysis of this situation facing women and girls, looking at the intersectional and intergenerational impacts, the harms that are brought about by the Taliban's policies, which many, and I have joined this, have called gender apartheid. The Afghan women that I have consulted with say that this term, although it's not yet a legal term, best describes their experience of living in Afghanistan these days. And just to clarify that there are also there are laws that are being violated in our view. That is, it's sometimes a little bit complicated to explain, but there's also gender persecution and persecution on other grounds. This is already a crime against humanity. The International Criminal Court is investigating Afghanistan. My understanding is that they are investigating this issue, and they could prosecute individuals. There's also the possibility of action in the International Court of Justice against Afghanistan for violations of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Maybe I'll leave it at that as an introduction, but I'd be happy to answer questions and maybe make some suggestions both for civil society and my suggestions for members of the international community, including the government of Norway. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll then turn to you, Tom. If you, first of all, if you have any comments to what Richard just presented us, and then afterwards, if you could tell us something about the report that I'd mentioned in the introduction that you published a couple of months ago.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. I will probably start with, or try to start with something you said about your mandate, because I think that points to the enormousness of your task. Your mandate is probably the most encompassing that exists at the Human Rights Council now to document and work on Afghanistan, as opposed to what other mandates and mandate holders have to deal with. At the same time, resources are limited, especially at the United Nations. And to a certain extent, though I will not talk about the report right now, but a little bit later, to a certain extent that was even a motivation for us to do what we did, because right after or briefly after the breakdown of the previous regime and the de facto government of today came into power on 15th of August 2021, then was a statement in December, a joint statement by the US and European partners on revenge killings and killings of that kind. And they basically said, well, we're aware of that, but we will measure the Taliban by their actions. So they criticized it, of course, and said we will measure the Taliban by their actions. But our thought then was, of course, one should do that, but how are you going to do that? You barely had sufficient resources to do that while you were on the ground. UNAMA was restricted, which is the United Nations Assistance Mission for Afghanistan, was restricted in their capacity to check upon human rights violations, etc., even while they had their own security with allied forces, etc. So how are you going to do it when you're out there and you don't have any eyes or let alone boots on the ground anymore? So that's when we started thinking about how one could at least contribute to that documentation process. So resources are always an issue. You mentioned, well, marginalized groups. Evidently, one of the biggest marginalized groups are women, and in Afghanistan in any case. And I was thinking about maybe commenting on, well, some of the challenges when you think about whether gender apartheid. Now we talk about gender persecution. Yes, it's in the Rome Statute. It would be a crime against humanity under Article 7, Paragraph 1H. And yes, from that point of view, it could be prosecuted by the ICC, by the International Criminal Court. But it is also a higher level of, or higher standard, because it would also have to prove, not that it should be a problem, but it takes more time to prove that it's been committed either systematically or at least widespread basis. So you need to have a lot of cases. You can't just have a couple of individual cases on that if it's supposed to be prosecuted as a crime against humanity, which gender persecution would be. Another aspect probably which interlocks with our efforts as well, briefly after the takeover and then repeatedly over several terms, the now de facto government has announced that, well, there is an amnesty for former security forces, armed forces, members of the armed forces of the former government. As recently as last week, the supreme leader of Afghanistan spoke about that as well again, and said that it's well, we're living peacefully together and the amnesty is still in place. But the fact is also, it's never been published in writing. It's always been stated in between, but never published in writing, as opposed to all of the other decrees banning girls above 6th grade from school, etc. So they put that never in writing. And writing or not, evidently it has not been followed, definitely not on a general level, and that's part of what we also wanted to look into when we started our report, or rather our research. The report was really just the final stage of a research project that went on for 1.5 years. So what we tried to do there was documenting as widely as possible the occurrences of revenge killings as a specific part of extrajudicial killings. All the killings we looked into were extrajudicial, but we call them revenge killings if the main motivation could be tracked down to the former status of a person as either a member of security staff or a poet, which they didn't like the outspokenness of, etc. And then we also looked into forced disappearances, torture cases, etc. And of course, what we would, and also others saw who looked into that, is that there often was a pattern of first a kidnapping, then tortured, and eventually you were killed. In total, we conducted on-the-ground interviews with Afghan staff that we cooperated with and directed on the ground in 433 interviews, and based on that we noted and documented about 770 individual cases of those crimes, and the higher than the individual interviews was because several of them experienced several human rights violations, including obviously the ultimate human right taken away from them, which is the right to life when they were killed. And one of the motivations there was also to be able to say to the Taliban also that states would be able, and other organizations would be able to say to the Taliban that not just you are responsible, but it is happening all over. Because what the Taliban often used to say whenever they were confronted with those killings taking place was that either that wasn't us, or those were some rogue actors, or maybe in one of the provinces there were some happenings, but not all over. And since no one really looked or had the capacity to look into all the provinces, it was easy to say. At the time when we started, the only projects or research of that kind were limited to 4 or 5 or 10 provinces of a total of 34 provinces and more than 400 districts. So when we then tried to create a project where we could have physical interviews in all of the provinces, and we found that with some variations a similar pattern appeared to have taken place in all the provinces, then we could go on and say, well, it's not somewhere a few rogue actors, it's really something you have done and taken part in revenge killings on a general basis. And also, it's not something that only took place in the immediate aftermath of your seizure of power, where one could say in a transition process, to use a mild term like that, one probably would expect that there's a higher degree of killing and revenge of that kind. But we also found cases that even 2 years after the takeover had taken place, and we still, although that report is done, we still receive reporting from our partners that every now and then it still occurs. And the second motivation then was to say, well, it is not only something that states that would be enticed to continue with business as usual with the current state of current de facto government of Afghanistan, disregarding the fact that those actions have taken place and are taking place. And the third motivation for us was the individual accountability issues, that in a few, obviously very restricted cases, because then you need a lot of evidence from many places, in a few select cases, maybe in the future, whether it's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or other international accountability mechanisms, might be able to make a case and actually prosecute some individual perpetrators, which at least would give some hope to those that felt utterly left behind, which is why we called the report also Those We Left Behind.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. We will come back to many things that you have been mentioning here, but I'd like you both to tell us a bit about something in this word revenge and in this word killing, both of those two things. One might think that who is revenging who, and what is actually Taliban today, because it's now almost 3 years since they came back to power, and what we know is Taliban one organization? Are there people within Taliban with different views on what's going on, and who are the people that are not part of the Taliban in Afghanistan at the moment? So tell us a bit about the political situation, if that's possible. Maybe you, Richard, would like to start.
Okay, I mean, Tom uses the term revenge killings. I don't think I've used that term, but I do understand what it means, and I think it's a useful term. I think the general amnesty that the Taliban declared soon after they took power, although they didn't put it in writing, as Tom mentioned, has not been respected, and I very much appreciate the work that the Human Rights Research League has done, and also I note that UNAMA, Human Rights, has reported, I think last year they reported that on at least 800 instances of these kind of taking revenge contrary to the general amnesty. But on your question, Mathilde, I would say that probably the highest priority for the Taliban leadership is to maintain unity, and that they have been relatively successful in doing so, both during the period of the conflict and since they've have retaken power. Occasionally you see difference of views expressed by some in the Taliban leadership, in particular about girls' education, but it doesn't really get any momentum. You hear one or two of the leaders speaking out, but then it dies down again. And I think that is in fact happening less often now, and is probably a sign that the Emir, Mullah Haibatullah in Kandahar, and the group around him are exercising more control, not less, than they did 3 years or so ago. I would also maybe add that probably the second priority is security, and the Taliban will list their achievements, that they have created security, that they wiped out corruption, that they've done the same with narcotics, and then the economy has not completely cratered. They've kept it afloat despite all the restrictions of the international community, and they feel, as a result of that they ought to get international recognition. The other side of this ledger is what they have not done, and that they are essentially at least an authoritarian state, probably a totalitarian state, because they do not accept any differences of views. There is no plurality allowed amongst the Taliban, which comes back to this issue of divisiveness and whether there's one Taliban or not, or two. And they feel that they've done enough to be recognized. On the other hand, human rights actors, people might, like me, say, no, you haven't. That a country that consistently violates human rights violations to the extent that the Taliban does, and in particular treats women, I would say, worse than any other country in the world, and there are some other pretty bad ones as well, should not be recognized. To do so would be on the wrong side of history. But I also, just as a final point, would say that I also feel it's false to look back on the 20 years of the Republic as a golden age. It wasn't. There were improvements, but there were also significant problems. And we shouldn't be kind of starry-eyed about that either. And when it comes to accountability, I'm one of those who says that there should be accountability for throughout the period of the conflict and for all parties to the conflict. I am not in favor of selective justice for one group or two groups for a certain period of time, because I think that selective justice is, firstly, it's not legally or morally right, but also it is not healthy for a durable, peaceful future for the country. But finally, I think if there's a feeling that there are pragmatists in Kabul who are in the cabinet and in the government ministries, and there are hard-line ideologues in Kandahar, I would say that at the moment, those in Kandahar appear to have the upper hand.
That brings me just to a follow-up question, because what you're actually saying is that the real power is no more in the capital, it's somewhere else. And then the country is actually ruled not from the capital anymore. It's from the place where the Taliban leaders are. That's in Kandahar, as you mentioned. Are there any support, or how much support is there in Afghanistan for Taliban? How many people actually support what they are doing and think it's okay?
I haven't done a survey of that, so it's only it's only an opinion. It's there. I mean, one of the things I would say is that the resistance to the Taliban is led by Afghan women who have extremely courageously continued to protest and not to accept the Taliban's restrictions. And I think it's almost unique in any country that women have fought and continue to do so, but non-violently fought, peacefully protested. And I am in favor of that, because there's a right to peacefully protest. But sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, that's. I mean, the women are courageously protesting, and I would also add then, how can they do that if they are not allowed to go out, not allowed to be without being accompanied by a man and so forth? So how has that been done and is it only in Kabul, or are these protests also around in elsewhere in Afghanistan?
Oh no, they're all over Afghanistan, and it's extremely difficult now to protest on the streets. Very rarely happens. Women protest in their homes online, and also find other ways of creative resistance. So, underground education, writing groups, poetry groups, and so on, which are largely online. Basically, continuing to stand up to the Taliban's increasing restrictions.
Are they being supported by men? Afghan men?
This comes back to whether does the Taliban have a lot of support in Afghanistan?
Yes.
And I say, look, there is no election, so we don't know. And they don't have any intention of having an election. I get mixed reports on this. I am aware of men who support Afghan women, the rights of Afghan women. I very seldom hear from Afghan women protesters who say that their fathers or their husbands or their brothers don't support them. Most of them do, and the criticism I hear is more from foreigners outside the country who say, where are the men? Afghan women don't often say that. Having said that, I'm also told by Afghan women, look, in general, there are a lot of Afghan men who are sympathetic to the Taliban's views. What percentage it is, we don't know. There's no election. But I would say there's a significant number of Afghan men who would support the Taliban's views. And when we talk, can I just move on to a slightly different issue,
Please,
but it's
yes.
relevant, I think, to this, is that when international actors make statements about Afghanistan or go to Afghanistan and meet with the Taliban, the Taliban's construction of the optics are largely for their own constituency. So in Norway or in another country, we might see that, well, maybe the Taliban are doing or saying this for the international community. I think that what they're doing more is when they are engaging with senior members of the UN or senior government officials, they are demonstrating that they are being accepted to their own constituency. And so that's something that I am suggesting all those who do engage be very careful about. Don't go with an all-male delegation. Make sure not only that women are with you, but women speak to the Taliban or lead the delegation. And in every discussion, even if it's a discussion on another perfectly legitimate issue, which might be about the environment, for example, climate change or agriculture, make sure that the message about human rights and the rights of women is also included in that discussion, and not just as an afterthought, as central to that discussion. That is what I feel, if there is to be engagement, it needs to be human rights-based engagement.
Tom, do you have any comments on the questions that I just asked?
Yes,
Richard?
actually I do.
Yes, please.
Let's see which of those I can actually put in here. Well, maybe start with the Taliban, one or several, or how
Yes,
many
please, yes.
are they? First of all, I agree with Richard that there's been this consolidation. Initially, we saw maybe more of a division, and that was in a certain way maybe a positive division in the sense that on a local level one could more, I don't want to say easily, but more often maybe finagle a way to have more space for women than the central, if you want to call it, central authorities would go and accept. Now that it's probably more consolidated, I also believe the Kandahar section has a much stronger, or the fief there has a stronger, or the upper hand. But also, I just read, I think it was published 2 weeks ago by the Seagull, like the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, which is in the US, as they report to the US Congress, and their report, where they also interviewed, now most recently, a few Afghans who had evidently fled eventually or been taken to the US, but who were former members of security forces and others. They said that, well, talking about the amnesty, they will never give us or someone like us, including Air Force pilots, etc., Afghan Air Force, amnesty, because after all, the Taliban, or a lot of the Taliban of today, are the children of those we killed over the years. About the number they used was 87,000 or so over the years. So amnesty will not happen. So some of the Taliban now are Taliban too, but still there's a connection. When it comes to, Richard mentioned the selectiveness of justice, a very important point as well, and I think some of that we comment to a certain extent in the report. I think it's important to remember, as you probably indicated, that a conflict, especially an armed conflict, never exists in a vacuum. There was something before and something after. And when you also look at what were the crime rates and casualties, etc., way before 2021, before the Taliban took over, they didn't look pretty either. That's true. And to a certain extent, the International Criminal Court also will take that into account, because they are not charged with looking at the crimes post-2021. No, their mandate is actually from 2003 onwards. And that takes into account that justice should never be selective. If I may, I would also like to comment on the how much support they have or not. And I think the tricky part is there might be many men who support maybe all of it. There might be many who support some of their policies and not all of them. And I would assume, but also we don't have exact numbers on the support issue, but what we do know is there's a strong divide between urban and rural areas. And I would assume that the more educated you are, or the more opportunities you had or your children had to go to school, to get an education, then you had more to lose now, and then you might be much more against their policies now. But the rural divide is actually about 75%, I think was the last number, of Afghanistan is defined as rural areas. And within rural areas, 63% of men supposedly cannot write or compute or read, and 90% of women. So I believe it is natural to think that those who were not, if you want to say, exposed to educational opportunities before, maybe do not feel as disengaged from what's happening now as those that were.
Yeah, let's move on to Taliban again, and my main question is how to engage with the Taliban and what can be done. And I also like to mention that a couple of months after the takeover in August 2021, some people or some Talibs came here to Oslo to engage in discussions here. So also your thoughts on that, on how this can be done. Should it be done, and if so, how should one engage with the Taliban?
I'm not in favor of isolation, and even if I was, it's too late. The Taliban already have made connections, particularly with countries in the region, and some very big countries. I can mention in the region. No country, I would say, has formally recognized the Taliban. The UN has not, at the General Assembly, given the Taliban their seat. The Credentials Committee has delayed this for 3 years now. But there are countries who have jumped into the space. So my position, my point is that engagement needs to be conditioned. There should be an avoidance of any normalization or legitimization of the de facto authorities until there are demonstrable, measurable, independently verified improvements in the human rights situation. And in this regard, I think that the independent assessment that was requested by the Security Council over a year ago and was delivered at the end of last year is quite interesting. It does propose engagement. It proposes a kind of political roadmap, including an intra-Afghan dialogue, and the appointment of a special envoy. The Taliban have not agreed to the special envoy, at least. But I think what I have noted in the report, it was written by Feridun Senioglu, who's a Turkish ambassador, a Turkish diplomat, is that the benchmarks were the international human rights treaties. So that, I think, is something to build on. So I think human rights needs to be included explicitly as a policy in future political processes involving Afghanistan. That's one. Two, Afghans, including especially Afghan women, must be also included in any future political processes, and they must be seriously consulted when making any international community policies related to Afghanistan.
I would like to add, what about when we're talking about the international community engaging in Afghanistan, I would like to have your comments on Russia and on China.
Yeah. Well, China has gone the furthest because it's actually accredited an Afghan ambassador in Beijing. Russia has also gone quite far, and there are also, talks that Russia has been convening since, years ago. I think that perhaps what you're getting at is that there is a geopolitical element to all of this. We tend to talk about human rights in terms of the rights of individual Afghans, communities of Afghans, be they women or different groups. But Afghanistan has a very long history of being geopolitically located. We know about the Great Game that is often referred to back into the 19th century, and that, I think, continues because we have on one side the kind of Western alliance, if we can call it that. On the other, the rise of China, the role that Russia plays now geopolitically, and Afghanistan is once again caught in the middle of this. So I try to stick to human rights and prioritizing human rights when it comes to political engagement, and we haven't really talked much about humanitarian and development, but I think we need to bear in mind these broader geopolitical dynamics that are going on.
So my last question before we go for a stop here for this conversation would of course be on the future of Afghanistan, and then of course the main issue here for this talk is human rights and women's position and women's opportunities. So maybe you, Tom, would just give us some comments on the future of Afghans and Afghanistan, and then you might conclude, Richard.
Well, maybe that could connect to humanitarian development nexus we did not talk about yet, but for any development of a country, you need the society and as much of the society you can use and that can participate. And obviously, if half of the population is at the very least severely restricted, then you really don't have the means to move forward the way you should. And that should be one of the key factors then also for any kind of engagement with the current regime. As you said, always have women included in any delegations and any of those concerns. But also it is important to keep in mind that when we talked about the restrictions women, especially and girls, experience now, then you have the mental health issue, which is very huge. I mean, a population in general that has been under stress for a long time due to war, civil war, and others, including the male population, already is strained in that regard. We're currently actually also doing a research project for the past year in Lebanon on that. And both countries, you could say, many differences, but all have experienced to a certain extent over 40 years of more or less conflict. And given the conflict has been much higher, especially during some of those years, in Afghanistan. But what we see then there is that, yes, there's mental health issues on a collective basis, and that's not more than the sum of the individual mental health issues that a country has. And the worst part, it even exists intergenerational. That means it could also affect, say, a child that has not been personally affected, but via the lesser support their parents or his parents could give that child because of that. And if you factor that in, and exact numbers do not exist yet, but it's evident that if at least half of the population may suffer from that kind of mental health issue or mental stress, you do not function at all at the same level that you could. And that doesn't mean it's black and white. Either you're not acting or working or living at all, or you're on your top level. But in between, there's so much lost. And without getting that up to speed, I look very grimly at the future of Afghanistan.
It will take time then.
It will.
You, Richard, what are your final comments?
I might kind of come at it slightly from a slightly different angle. Although I do, I recognize, coming from this mental health perspective is incredibly important. I've noted that the UN Secretary General has said that the future should be an Afghanistan that is at peace with itself, at peace with the region, and at peace with the world. Now, I think that's pretty easy to say, quite hard to do. The Security Council called for a roadmap. I think what's come out is, and I heard someone refer to it as a roadmap to a roadmap, but something that doesn't have any detail in it so far. And there needs to be a vision. There needs to be something more detailed. I think that it's extremely complicated because on one hand, there is a group in power which appears to be unbending in its ideology, willing to use violence at the first, not only resort, not just the last resort, and is committed to creating their vision of an Islamic emirate, which even, and I think this is really important, other Islamic states are not fully supporting. Certainly on issues like girls' education, they are isolated. And I think part of the solution comes from the region, but more so, I think it comes from within Afghans within Afghanistan. And your question, Mathilde, about how much support do the Taliban have, I think I'll come back to that to finish off with by saying that the resistance that we're seeing from women in Afghanistan is a kind of glimmer of hope for the future and needs to be supported. But it will be I think it will take time. It will be a long road. There does need, and I mentioned that the Taliban's first priority is their solidarity with each other, their unity. What I think we need to see is more solidarity and unity and direction on the other side, both among Afghans who do not agree with the Taliban and amongst members of the international community who have different positions as well, part of that being complicated by the kind of geopolitics that we just discussed. But I think even beyond that, it's important. I think I would want a principled approach around human rights. You would expect me to say that, and that's what I believe in, could result in a durable and a successful Afghanistan where the mental health problems are reduced. I don't think, I'm all for providing psychosocial support to Afghans because I think Afghans need it because of the terrible trauma, but it's not a solution. The individual approach is not going to solve this problem of mental health. It requires a social and political change.
So what you're actually saying, both of you, is that the future of Afghanistan lies within Afghanistan itself.
I think it does, but it also requires support from the international side.
Thank you very much, both of you, then, for this conversation. To my right here, I have Richard Bennett and then Tom Sitting. It's been a pleasure to welcome you here in Oslo. Thank you.
Thanks you, Mathilde. Thank you.
And thanks also to both of you listening to this as a podcast or watching this as a live event online. Thank you very much.